So Canada just cut Washington out, and the alternative system was already running. The White House had threatened a 50% tariff on nearly $20 billion in Canadian goods. It gave Ottawa 30 days to reconsider its position. American officials expected the pressure to force Canada back into a familiar pattern: negotiate urgently, preserve access to the U.S. market, and postpone every alternative that might reduce Washington's leverage. But the documents in Ottawa told a different story. Canada had already signed into Europe's $150 billion safe defense procurement system. The United Kingdom's entry into the CPTPP was already ratified, opening a rules-based market of 598 million people. A $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund was already moving infrastructure toward Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic routes. And the Port of Vancouver was already handling hundreds of billions of dollars in trade with customers around the world. Washington was not confronting a Canadian contingency plan. It was confronting a Canadian operating system. Warren Buffett's economic logic cuts through the political language with a single devastating line: the time to build a second road is before the first owner closes the gate. Canada had spent months doing exactly that. It did not announce independence after the tariff threat. It produced documents showing that diversification had already passed through cabinet approvals, treaty procedures, procurement rules, port planning, and corporate budgets. The immediate danger is real. A 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion in trade can damage manufacturers, suppress hiring, weaken the Canadian dollar, and raise prices for American buyers. But the deeper story is not about whether Canada can avoid pain. It is about whether Washington can still decide what Canada does next. When you hear what happened during the reconstructed briefing in Ottawa, why a single blue folder brought the room to silence, and why officials stopped discussing how to prevent diversification and began discussing how to manage it, you will understand why this moment may be remembered as the day North American leverage changed direction. Hit subscribe because the tariff is public, but the machinery replacing dependence is operating behind it. Let me walk you through how Canada reached the point where Washington's threat arrived after the decision had already been made. For more than 30 years, the North American economy rested on a quiet institutional bargain. Canada accepted extraordinary exposure to one market because the United States offered scale, proximity, legal stability, and a defense relationship deeper than any other in the Western world. Auto components could cross the border several times before a finished vehicle reached a dealer. Canadian energy supplied American cities and factories. American machinery, capital, software, and consumer demand helped sustain Canadian industries from Ontario to Alberta. The system moved approximately $1.6 trillion in goods each year among Canada, the United States, and Mexico. That arrangement was never equal in size. It was supposed to be equal in rules. The erosion began when rules became conditional. Sectoral tariffs struck steel, aluminum, automobiles, and softwood lumber. Threats against sovereignty entered public language. The United States declined to grant the USMCA a clean 16-year extension on July 1st, leaving the agreement in force but subject to annual reviews until renewal or expiry in 2036. Then, on July 20, the White House invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 and announced a 50% tariff on a broad range of Canadian products, scheduled to begin August 19. The affected trade was estimated at about 28 billion Canadian dollars, or nearly $20 billion in U.S. terms. According to the White House, the measure answered Canadian policies involving automobiles, alcohol, and dairy. According to Ottawa, it was the latest unilateral action in a pattern that had already violated the spirit and, in Canada's view, the terms of the North American Agreement. According to people familiar with the talks cited by Reuters, Canada and the United States had not even begun formal negotiations when the new 50% threat was announced. Most Americans do not realize how much preparation was already underway on the Canadian side. In June 2025, Canada and the European Union signed a security and defense partnership. European governments authorized negotiations for Canadian participation in the SAFE instrument in September. Member states endorsed the arrangement in December. The agreement was signed on February 14, 2026, and formally concluded on June 15. Canada became the first non-European country admitted into a $150 billion system designed to finance common defense procurement. The alternative was not one agreement. It was a stack. Canada and France signed a classified information framework covering defense, space, cybersecurity, advanced communications, aerospace, and maritime technology. Ottawa ratified the United Kingdom's accession to the CPTPP on July 3, with implementation between Canada and Britain scheduled for September 1. That enlarged trade framework covers more than 598 million people and 14.4% of global economic output. Canada launched a $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund and a $1 billion Arctic Infrastructure Fund. It advanced a Vancouver Gateway strategy through a port that connects Canadian producers with roughly 170 countries. It lowered the threshold for its Buy Canadian procurement policy from $25 million to $5 million, expanding the number of federal contracts exposed to domestic preference measures. The contrast was severe. Washington prepared a 30-day ultimatum. Ottawa had spent more than a year building legal, physical, and financial alternatives. This did not mean Canada could replace the American market. It could not. Nearly $20 billion in threatened exports represented real businesses and real jobs. The 50% tariff could reduce growth, delay investment, and hurt small manufacturers employing 10, 50, or 200 people. But dependence is not measured only by the share of trade flowing through one border. It is measured by whether a government believes it has any credible option when that border becomes political. For Canada, the tipping point came when Washington treated diversification itself as evidence of disloyalty. The American complaint was not merely that Canada had restricted U.S. alcohol or protected dairy. It was that Canada had granted Europe access Washington believed should remain uniquely American. That was the moment Ottawa stopped asking how to restore the old relationship and began asking how much of the old relationship could safely survive. And then the answer was placed on a conference table. What follows is a reconstruction based on the public timeline, official documents, and reported negotiating positions, not a verbatim transcript. The room is a secure conference room inside Ottawa's central government complex, used when a political problem has become an economic security problem. A maple table runs through the room. There are no cameras. There are only folders. A white folder contains the American tariff proclamations. A red binder contains sector-by-sector exposure, cement, dairy, liquor, wood products, and manufactured goods. On the cover are three numbers: 50%, $20 billion, 30 days. Beside it is a blue European folder. A digital map fills the wall screen. Red lines run south from Canadian industrial centers toward the United States. Blue lines run east toward Atlantic ports in Europe. Green lines run west toward Vancouver and the Indo-Pacific. A thin white line reaches north toward planned Arctic infrastructure. The map represents contracts, port capacity, procurement eligibility, and projects already authorized. Based on official Canadian planning documents, the first question in this reconstruction is not whether the tariff will hurt. Nobody pretends otherwise. The question is how to prevent short-term pain from restoring long-term dependence. The trade minister begins with the $20 billion exposure. Cement producers face immediate risk because regional construction markets are difficult to replace. Liquor exporters can find other customers, but distribution systems take time. Small manufacturers may not have the cash to absorb a 50% border charge while waiting for a new buyer. The Bank of Canada has already described an economy weakened by trade uncertainty, uneven growth, and unemployment between 6.5% and 7%. The room understands the human meaning beneath those figures. A factory with 80 employees experiences a tariff as canceled shifts. A family approaching retirement experiences it as a pension account that stops growing. A trucking company experiences annual USMA reviews as a customer refusing to sign a 5-year contract. The Prime Minister listens without interrupting. A pencil rests beside his hand. He has written one phrase on the briefing page: what is already moving? The answer comes in sequence. SAFE is already moving. The 150 billion European instrument has been legally established. Canada's agreement was signed on February 14 and formally concluded on June 15. Canadian firms can enter common procurements involving ammunition, air defense, aerospace, cyber, maritime platforms, and secure communications. The United Kingdom channel is already moving. Canada ratified British accession to the CPTPP on July 3. The rules are scheduled to apply between the two countries on September 1 across a bloc covering 598 million people. The domestic procurement channel is already moving. Federal solicitations worth more than $3 billion have been touched by the Buy Canadian policy. The threshold has been lowered from 25 million to 5 million. The infrastructure channel is already moving. A $5 billion diversification fund is aimed at transport corridors. Vancouver is being prepared for more traffic toward Asia. Atlantic capacity is being examined for Europe. Arctic infrastructure is being framed as sovereignty, defense, and market access. The Prime Minister circles the words already moving. Then the secure phone rings. The call in this reconstruction comes from Washington through the established trade channel. The American message is controlled but unmistakable. The United States is prepared to intensify negotiations. Relief may be possible before the 30-day period expires. But Canada must show movement on measures Washington considers discriminatory. Alcohol restrictions, vehicle treatment, and dairy access must change. Ottawa should avoid actions that deepen preferential access for European suppliers while talks are underway. No one speaks while the message is repeated. The senior Canadian negotiator asks for clarification. Are they asking us to pause new European arrangements, she says, or reverse completed ones? An aide checks the American wording. The distinction has not been made. The negotiator opens the blue folder. The metal rings release with a quiet snap. The first page is the European Council decision. The second shows the agreement date, February 14, 2026. The third shows formal conclusion, June 15. The fourth summarizes the $150 billion instrument. She slides the folder toward the center of the table. There is nothing to pause, she says. The room remains still. The alternative is already running. 5 seconds pass. Then 10. The air system can be heard above the ceiling panels. Someone at the far end lowers a pen but does not put it down. On the wall, the red roots into the United States remain brighter and thicker than all the others. The blue and green roots are smaller. But they are there. Canada does not need those roots to replace the red lines tomorrow. It needs them to exist credibly enough that Washington can no longer assume every Canadian decision ends at the southern border. The Prime Minister asks the question that changes the briefing. What would it cost to stop? The defense official answers first. Canadian companies would lose access to European tenders. The procurement official says firms that have begun compliance work would absorb costs without contracts. The transport official says ports and railways are already planning around diversification funding. The finance official explains that reversing course under pressure would teach every market that Canada's international agreements are subordinate to American tariff threats. The cost is not only financial, it is credibility. A sovereign country cannot ask Europe, Britain, France, Japan, and Australia to sign long-term agreements, then suspend them whenever Washington announces a 50% tariff. No reliable partner would trust the next Canadian signature. No company would build a factory around a promise that could be withdrawn in 30 days. The senior negotiator picks up the secure phone and delivers Ottawa's response. Canada is prepared to discuss the North American relationship intensively. It is prepared to address legitimate concerns. It is prepared to negotiate a good agreement, not a fast agreement. But existing Canadian partnerships will not be frozen, reversed, or submitted for American approval. A pause comes from the other end. The American official asks whether that is Canada's final position. The answer is calm. It is Canada's operating position. When the call ends, nobody celebrates. The 50% tariff remains scheduled. The $20 billion remains exposed. The 30-day clock continues to run. But the psychological structure has changed. Washington expected to negotiate over whether Canada could build an alternative. Ottawa had just said the alternative was already opening markets, funding corridors, and training suppliers. The white tariff folder is closed. The blue folder remains open. And within hours, the consequences begin arriving faster than either side can contain them. The first consequence appeared in Washington, not Ottawa. The U.S. Trade Representative told senators that the administration wanted interim arrangements with Canada and Mexico by the end of the year, while difficult USMCA questions could continue into 2027. Reuters reported that formal U.S.-Canada talks had not yet begun, even though the 50% tariff was scheduled for August 19. That contrast was devastating. The administration had created a 30-day deadline before building a formal negotiating table. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said he and Donald Trump had agreed to intensify talks and that all options remained available if the tariff proceeded. Ottawa's language was restrained. It did not declare victory. It did not claim the $20 billion threat was harmless. It said Canada wanted a good deal, not a fast deal. According to people from all three North American countries familiar with the talks, bilateral processes were moving on different tracks, with U.S.-Mexico negotiations months ahead of informal U.S.-Canada discussions. That created a second pressure point. Washington could use Mexican concessions as a template for Canada. Canada could refuse and risk being isolated inside the trade agreement it helped build. The $1.6 trillion North American system was no longer functioning as a single negotiation. It was being divided into separate rooms. Markets absorbed the uncertainty immediately. The Canadian dollar fell to a one-week low near 70.9 U.S. cents after the tariff threat. Investors reduced expectations for Bank of Canada rate increases. The two-year Canadian yield declined, and the gap with comparable U.S. debt widened. The following day, the currency recovered slightly as oil prices rose, but the trade risk discount remained. That movement may look small on a television screen. It does not feel small when translated through household finances. A weaker Canadian dollar makes imported food, machinery, medicine, and travel more expensive. Lower growth expectations can reduce hiring. Delayed investment reduces productivity. Retirement funds exposed to banks, railways, manufacturers, energy companies, and retailers begin carrying the cost long before a tariff collector stands at the border. Before I continue, let me ask you something important. Have you ever made a major decision while feeling worried, rushed, or unsure which information you could trust? That is how costly mistakes often begin. A frightening headline can influence your investments. Conflicting health advice can leave you confused. A convincing salesperson, online scam, or emotional family situation can pressure you into acting before you have checked the facts. And after 50, the consequences can be much greater. One poor decision may affect your retirement savings, your health, your independence, or your peace of mind for years. That is why I want you to take a look at the decision trap. It is a practical guide designed to help adults over 50 recognize fear, manipulation, hidden bias, misleading information, and high-pressure tactics before making an important decision. Inside, you will find a simple step-by-step system for slowing the situation down, checking the evidence, asking the right questions, comparing your options, and protecting yourself from mistakes that could become expensive. Do not wait until a bad decision teaches you the lesson the hard way. Click the link in the description and get your copy of The Decision Trap. Now, with that important warning in mind, let's get back to our main topic. The Bank of Canada had already warned that trade uncertainty was holding back investment, and that Canadian output had barely changed between the first quarter of 2025 and the first quarter of 2026. Unemployment had remained between 6.5% and 7%. The new 50% threat arrived in an economy that could absorb disruption, but not without scars. Then the alternative system began producing visible signals. Canada's agreement with the European Safe Instrument was no longer described merely as diplomatic positioning. It was an industrial channel into $150 billion in financing. The Canada-France Classified Information Agreement gave firms a legal framework for sensitive aerospace, cyber, maritime, and advanced technology projects. The UK, as CPTPP accession, was scheduled to create new rules on September 1 across a market of 598 million people. The Vancouver strategy was explicitly designed to diversify trade and move more Canadian exports toward global customers. Buy Canadian procurement had already reached solicitations worth billions. According to Canadian officials, these programs were designed to strengthen resilience, not punish the United States. According to American officials, Canada's preferential treatment of European products was part of the reason for the tariff. Both statements can be true. That is what makes the irony so destructive. The United States imposed pressure partly because Canada was diversifying. The pressure then increased the economic value of diversification. Business associations began rerunning models. Companies reviewed whether to accelerate shipments before August 19. Exporters examined British and European procurement rules. Provincial governments asked which ports, rail lines, mines, factories, and financing programs could move faster. The 30-day clock did not stop the alternative. It became a deadline for accelerating it. And then Warren Buffett's framework explained why the immediate market reaction was only the first invoice. Buffett's economic translation begins with a principle that is simple. Concentration creates efficiency until the concentrated partner changes the rules. For decades, the United States was the rational market for Canadian firms. Geography reduced transportation costs. Similar standards simplified production. The USMCA and its predecessors reduced border friction. American demand offered scale no European or Asian buyer could match. Building around that relationship was not weakness. It was sound capital allocation. But sound concentration becomes dangerous dependency when access is repriced by political decision. A 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion in goods does not need to cover every Canadian export to change corporate behavior. It only needs to demonstrate that even products protected by a trade agreement can become bargaining instruments. The price is paid by affected industries. The lesson is absorbed by every industry. Buffett would translate the $150 billion SAFE agreement as an investor. He would not call it a replacement market. Canadian companies will not receive $150 billion. They must qualify, compete, form partnerships, meet content rules, and win contracts. But optionality does not require certainty. It requires a credible chance. A Canadian aerospace company qualifying for European procurement has purchased an option. A shipbuilder entering a French or British supply chain has purchased an option. A pension fund financing Atlantic port capacity has purchased an option. The value of each option rises every time Washington threatens access to the main market. That is why the alternative was already running before it was large. In more than 60 years of buying businesses, evaluating managers, and watching strong companies weaken through arrogance, Warren Buffett has returned to one truth. A customer may tolerate a higher price, but it will not indefinitely tolerate being reminded that it has no choice. The moment a dominant supplier says, "You cannot leave," the customer begins paying to prove that it can. Canada is the customer and supplier at the same time. It sells energy, minerals, food, manufactured inputs, and defense expertise. It buys machinery, investment, technology, and access. Washington's leverage is enormous because the relationship operates in both directions. But leverage is not ownership. This is where the $1.6 trillion North American trade matters. The 50% tariff targets roughly $20 billion. That is painful but relatively small beside the wider system. The danger is not only that the tariff harms covered trade. The danger is that it reprices trust across the entire $1.6 trillion structure. A company deciding where to build a $500 million plant does not ask only what today's tariff is. It asks what the rules may be 5 years from now. A worker deciding whether to retrain for an auto parts job asks whether the factory has a future. A household approaching retirement asks whether its pension fund is carrying political risk it did not carry before. Buffett's logic would say, uncertainty acts like a tax, even when customs collects nothing. It delays factories, it shortens contracts, it raises financing costs, it holds cash on the sidelines. The Bank of Canada's weak investment data is the national version of a board delaying a project because management cannot trust the operating environment. Then comes the philosophical authority. A deal is not durable because one side can punish the other. It is durable because both sides believe tomorrow's rules will resemble today's. That belief allows capital to move, people to train, companies to specialize, and families to plan. Break that belief often enough and the parties insure themselves. The $150 billion SAFE system is insurance. The 598 million person CPTPP market is insurance. The $5 billion Corridors Fund is insurance. None of it eliminates the need for the United States. It reduces the cost of refusing the next unacceptable demand. And Buffett's devastating verdict would be this: Washington used a tariff to prove Canada was dependent, and Canada used the tariff to justify becoming less dependent. The policy achieved the precise opposite of its stated objective. It was intended to pull commerce back toward the United States. It made every alternative investment easier to defend. But the economic consequences are only one layer. The next reaches NORAD, Five Eyes, the Arctic, and the credibility of American alliances themselves. The first cascading consequence is physical and therefore difficult to reverse. Ports expand, rail systems are upgraded, suppliers obtain European certifications, factories purchase specialized equipment, engineers receive security clearances, defense firms join multinational consortiums. Once those investments are made, they do not disappear because a future White House restores a friendlier tone. Infrastructure does not listen to speeches. Contracts do not forget who signed them. The $5 billion Trade Diversification Corridors Fund is not symbolic if it moves grain, minerals, energy, manufactured goods, and military equipment toward Atlantic and Pacific customers. The Vancouver Gateway is not symbolic when it facilitates hundreds of billions of dollars in trade with roughly 170 countries. The $150 billion SAFE system is not symbolic once Canadian firms bid alongside European partners. The 598 million person CPTPP market is not symbolic once British procurement rules begin applying on September 1. The second consequence is political. In Canada, any government that appears to surrender signed European or Pacific agreements under a 30-day American threat would face severe resistance. Provincial leaders have their own industries. British Columbia sees Pacific ports and critical minerals. Alberta sees energy routes. Ontario sees autos and manufacturing. Quebec sees aerospace, aluminum, defense, and hydroelectricity. Atlantic Canada sees ports, shipbuilding, and European access. In the United States, the pain does not divide neatly by party. Michigan and Ohio need integrated auto supply chains. Construction states need cement. Retailers need predictable prices. Border communities need tourism and trucking. Farmers need Canadian customers. A 50% tariff can sound powerful at a rally and still become expensive inside a warehouse. The third consequence reaches defense. NORAD is a joint command structure built around shared warning, aerospace control, and maritime awareness. Five Eyes is an intelligence partnership based on extraordinary trust. Canada will not abandon either because of a commercial dispute. But institutional relationships have atmospheres. Officers can cooperate while political confidence deteriorates above them. Procurement choices can shift. Classified research partnerships can broaden. The Canada-France Information Agreement, the SAFE mechanism, Canadian observation of the Global Combat Air Program, and expanded European maritime cooperation create additional defense pathways. In the Arctic, the stakes become sharper. Canada needs radar, satellites, ice-capable vessels, ports, airfields, communications, drones, and undersea monitoring. The United States needs Canadian geography, information, resources, and cooperation. Russia and China need only observe any fracture. If economic coercion weakens political trust between the countries defending North America's northern approaches, the strategic benefit flows outward. The fourth consequence is the international signal. Before you leave, think about what one bad decision could cost you. A rushed investment, a misleading health claim, a convincing scam, or one decision made under fear could cost far more than $59. The decision trap gives you a practical system to slow down, verify the facts, recognize pressure, and protect your money, health, independence, and peace of mind. You may hesitate over the price today, but the real question is this: what could it cost you to face your next major decision without a clear system? Click the link in the description and get the decision trap for $59. Because avoiding one preventable mistake could make this guide worth many times its price.
Paspin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi makhj zama pat paspin ka panashi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi sabar ba mizrasta da didan shi سترګې ټول کمې بدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ په سپین کفن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم سترګو خمارو دې رنځور کړم اوس کله علاج مې په لندن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کفن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اوس مې په پختنا ولې ناراضي اسه به خراب د مینې خوان شي صبر به مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کفن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کفن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما اسه د برباد عبدل زرین کړما په आवाज د خالد شاه مزړه پیوان شي صبر با مزړه ستا د دیدن شي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کا پناشي مخ چې زما پټ پسپین کا پناشي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن شي صبر با مې زړه ستا د دیدن